It was June 10th, 1991. South Lake Tahoe, California. A quiet town surrounded by pine forests, known more for its beauty than for crime. On that morning, 11-year-old Jaycee Lee Dugard prepared for the short walk to her school bus. She wore her favorite pink jacket, kissed her mother goodbye, and set out along the familiar road. For her family, it was a routine day. For Jaycee, it would be the last normal morning of her childhood. Just steps from her own home, a car pulled up. Witnesses later recalled a man and a woman inside. In mere seconds, Jaycee vanished. The car sped away, leaving behind only confusion, terror, and silence. The scene was chaotic. Neighbors rushed out, some shouting, others frozen in disbelief. One neighbor on a bicycle tried to chase the car, but it disappeared into the winding streets. By the time Jaycee's stepfather heard the commotion, it was too late. She was gone. Law enforcement mobilized quickly. Helicopters scanned the mountains. Officers combed the neighborhoods. Flyers with Jaycee's photo spread across California. Her mother, Terry Probin, pleaded on television for her daughter's safe return. The case gripped the local community, then the nation. But as days turned into weeks, the trail grew cold. The descriptions were vague: a man, a woman, a gray car. Police gathered hundreds of tips, but none led to Jaycee. Hope began to fade. For Jaycee's family, life became a cycle of waiting. Birthdays passed. Holidays arrived and departed, each one marked by an empty chair at the table. Her mother kept her room exactly as it was, clinging to the belief that Jaycee would one day walk back through the door. The disappearance also raised deeper questions. How could a child vanish in broad daylight, steps from home? Were the systems designed to protect children, schools, police, communities, truly prepared? The case revealed uncomfortable truths about the limitations of missing person investigations in the early 1990s. As the years stretched on, Jaycee became another face on a poster, another unsolved mystery. Yet behind that fading photograph, she was still alive, and her story was far from over. After Jaycee's disappearance, the world outside carried on. But for her family, time seemed to freeze. Her mother appeared on television, begging for her daughter's safe return. Billboards went up. Flyers with Jaycee's picture lined store windows, post offices, and gas stations. For months, the search was relentless. And yet, nothing. The tips slowed, the media moved on, and resources shifted to other cases. For the Dugard family, this was a second kind of torment. Not only the absence of their daughter, but the silence of a world that seemed to forget. Meanwhile, Jaycee was not gone. She was alive, hidden in plain sight, only miles away. For the next 18 years, her life would unfold in captivity. Years of control, manipulation, and isolation. Her captor, Philip Garrido, was a convicted offender with a disturbing history. Years earlier, he had been arrested for assault and kidnapping. Despite this, he was eventually released, placed under parole, and somehow slipped through the cracks of the system. It was during this time of supposed supervision that he took Jaycee. With the help of his wife Nancy, he concealed her in a backyard compound, a maze of tents and sheds hidden behind fences and trees. To neighbors, the backyard seemed cluttered, odd perhaps, but never suspicious enough.
Inside this hidden world, Jaycee grew up. She entered captivity as a child. She would emerge decades later as an adult. Those years were marked by control. Garrido imposed strict boundaries. He decided when she ate, when she slept, and when she could step outside. He forced her into complete dependence. He told her escape was impossible, that the outside world was dangerous, that no one would believe her if she tried. For Jaycee, survival meant adapting. She learned to find fragments of normalcy in small things: a book, a pet cat, even the sound of a distant airplane overhead. Moments that reminded her the world outside still existed, even if it felt unreachable.
Her family, meanwhile, struggled to move forward while never letting go. Birthdays turned into anniversaries of her disappearance. Each year they held vigils, hoping someone, somewhere, might come forward with answers. The lost years tell a story not only of Jaycee's resilience, but of the failure of systems meant to protect. Despite Garrido's criminal record, parole checks, and neighbors raising concerns, no one discovered her hidden prison. For nearly 2 decades, Jaycee was living in silence, only miles from her childhood home. Her case would later raise difficult questions about law enforcement, parole supervision, and community awareness. But at the time, she remained invisible, a child lost in plain sight. Behind the Garridos' suburban home in Antioch, California, stood an unremarkable backyard. To the casual observer, it looked messy: scattered tarps, tents, and makeshift sheds. But hidden within that clutter was a secret world where Jaycee spent the majority of her life. The compound was a maze. Corrugated metal sheets leaned against fences. Old furniture blocked pathways. At the very back stood a series of tents and outbuildings, invisible to anyone who didn't step inside. This was where Jaycee lived, a child transformed into a captive. Her first weeks were marked by restraints and fear. Over time, the handcuffs were removed, but the psychological chains remained. Garrido's strategy was not only physical confinement, but mental control. He convinced Jaycee she could never leave, that the world was unsafe, and that her only option was submission. To reinforce this, he created routines. He decided when she could walk in the yard, when she could eat, when she could rest. He inserted himself into every corner of her existence. And to maintain dominance, he alternated between cruelty and small tokens: a radio, a book, a television limited to shopping channels, objects that looked like gifts, but in reality were tools of control. As the years passed, Jaycee grew older. In that backyard, she became a teenager, then an adult. Garrido involved her in odd projects: printing businesses, religious ramblings, even long monologues about hearing voices. At times, Jaycee was forced to help him with his delusions, becoming both caretaker and captive. Neighbors occasionally noticed strange things. Some reported children in the backyard who didn't seem to belong. Others questioned the tents and structures hidden behind tall fences. Yet each time authorities visited, parole officers, police, even federal agents, they never looked closely enough. Garrido's explanations were accepted. Jaycee remained undiscovered. For Jaycee, this was a life suspended. She learned to endure long stretches of silence, interrupted only by Garrido's unpredictable presence. She took care of pets, tended small gardens, and clung to fragments of hope. But outside the compound, the world kept moving. Technology advanced. Friends from her old school grew up, graduated, started families. Jaycee remained frozen in a hidden prison, waiting for a rescue that never seemed to come. The tragedy of this period is not only the confinement itself, but the repeated missed opportunities. Time and again, officials visited Garrido's home. Time and again, they overlooked what lay just beyond the fence. Each failure added another year to Jaycee's captivity. Nearly 2 decades passed this way. 18 years stolen from a single life. A backyard prison hidden in plain sight. Life in the backyard compound settled into a grim routine. Jaycee, still a child when she was taken, had to adapt in order to survive. Garrido maintained absolute control. He dictated her daily schedule, when she ate, when she slept, when she was allowed to step outside into the enclosed yard. Every choice, no matter how small, was filtered through him. In those early months, Jaycee lived in constant fear. The physical restraints were eventually removed, but the psychological ones never disappeared. Garrido convinced her that escape was impossible, that the world beyond the fence was full of dangers, and that no one would believe her if she cried out for help. Isolation became both her prison and her reality. At times, Garrido introduced small objects into her life: a book, a radio, or a television restricted to shopping channels. On the surface, they looked like kindness, but in reality they were instruments of control, reminders that every aspect of her environment was in his hands. Over the years, Jaycee found ways to endure. She built inner worlds, using imagination to escape the boundaries of the compound. She developed coping strategies, focusing on small routines of her own, caring for pets, writing in journals, and creating drawings that gave shape to the emotions she could not voice. These small acts of resilience helped her hold on to fragments of identity. The paradox of her situation was stark. Only miles from her childhood home, Jaycee lived a life completely separated from society. The sounds of neighbors' conversations, distant traffic, and passing airplanes were constant reminders that freedom existed just beyond the fence, but remained unattainable. Meanwhile, Garrido spiraled deeper into his own delusions. He believed he was guided by voices, that he had a special mission, that somehow keeping Jaycee was part of a divine plan. He wrote long journals, ranted to himself, and occasionally tried to involve her in these distorted beliefs. For Jaycee, navigating his unstable mind was yet another survival skill. The system, too, failed repeatedly. Parole officers visited Garrido's home more than once. Police responded to calls about children in the yard. Each time they overlooked the obvious. The backyard, cluttered and shielded, was never properly searched. Jaycee remained invisible, a missing child hidden in plain sight. For her family, the years were unbearable. Her mother, Terry, refused to give up hope. She kept Jaycee's room intact, her belongings untouched, as if preparing for her return at any moment. The family marked birthdays not with celebration, but with vigils. Each year was another reminder of absence. And yet, despite everything, Jaycee endured. She was more than a victim of circumstance. She was a survivor, building strength quietly, waiting for a chance that would one day come. As years passed, Jaycee's life inside the compound changed in ways no child should ever endure. Still a teenager, she gave birth to her first daughter, a child born not in a hospital, but in a shack hidden behind fences and tarps. Alone, terrified, and with no medical care, Jaycee brought her baby into the world. She was just 14 years old. For most teenagers, this would be a time of school dances, friendships, and first steps toward independence. For Jaycee, it was the beginning of a new role, not only captive, but mother. Over the next few years, she gave birth to a second daughter. Both children grew up believing their world was limited to the backyard compound. They played in the tents, explored the cluttered spaces, and knew nothing of the freedom waiting just beyond the fence. For Jaycee, motherhood became both a burden and a source of strength. On one hand, it deepened her dependency on Garrido, who positioned himself as the head of this distorted family. On the other, it gave her a powerful reason to keep going. Her daughters became her lifeline, her anchor, her motivation to endure. Garrido, meanwhile, inserted his unstable beliefs into their daily lives. He claimed to hear voices. He told Jaycee that he was chosen for a higher purpose. At times, he forced her and the children to listen to long, rambling monologues. Other times, he tried to present himself as a caring figure, a twisted form of manipulation that blurred the lines between captor and provider. Neighbors occasionally noticed strange details. Some reported seeing young girls in the yard, calling them Garrido's nieces. Others wondered about the tents and makeshift buildings multiplying behind the fence. Yet every time authorities checked, Garrido offered explanations that went unquestioned. Parole officers came and went. Police responded to calls. The truth that a kidnapped girl and her children were living in the backyard remained hidden. For Jaycee, each visit from officials brought a complicated mix of hope and despair. She wanted rescue, but feared the consequences. She worried for her daughters, uncertain of what Garrido might do if she exposed him. And so, she stayed silent. Survival meant compliance, even when freedom seemed just a question away. These were the lost years of Jaycee's motherhood. She taught her daughters as best she could, creating lessons from books, nature, and scraps of information. She tried to give them stability within chaos, to shield them from the darkness of their reality. But she could not give them what they deserved most: freedom. The failure was not only Garrido's crime, it was also systemic. Time and again the warning signs were missed. Opportunities to discover the truth slipped through the cracks. And so Jaycee remained hidden, raising her children under the control of a man who should never have been free.
By 2009, Jaycee had been missing for 18 years. Her case was considered cold, her name known only to family, investigators, and a dwindling circle of advocates who refused to forget. During this time, Philip Garrido spiraled deeper into instability. He believed he was on a mission from God. He wrote pages of delusional manifestos, and increasingly, he sought to involve others in his supposed revelations. In August 2009, Garrido appeared at the University of California, Berkeley campus. He was accompanied by two young girls, Jaycee's daughters. They were quiet, withdrawn, and dressed in unusual clothing. Something about them caught the attention of two campus police officers. The officers listened as Garrido rambled about starting a new religious movement. His speech was disorganized, his behavior unsettling. But what alarmed the officers most was the presence of the girls. They sensed something was wrong.
The officers contacted Garrido's parole officer, alerting him to the situation. Soon after, Garrido was called in for questioning. At first, he brought Jaycee and the two children with him, introducing Jaycee under a false name. She seemed nervous, deferential, unwilling to speak freely. To the untrained eye, she looked like a family friend. But the officers pressed further. Over the next hours, Garrido rambled, contradicting himself. The officers noticed Jaycee's discomfort. And finally, after nearly 2 decades of silence, she revealed her true identity. She was Jaycee Lee Dugard, the girl who had vanished in 1991. The revelation was explosive. 18 years of searching, of unanswered questions, came crashing to a close. Law enforcement rushed to confirm the details. Fingerprints, records, and family identification left no doubt. Jaycee had been found. Her family was stunned. For years they had lived with uncertainty, never knowing whether she was alive or dead. And now, in a single phone call, hope turned into reality. Terry Probin, her mother, wept as she prepared to see her daughter again. For Jaycee, the transition was overwhelming. After years of control, secrecy, and fear, she stepped into a world that had moved on without her. Technology, culture, and even her hometown had changed. She was 30 years old, but had lived nearly 2/3 of her life in captivity. The rescue also exposed staggering failures. How had parole officers, neighbors, and police missed the signs for so long? Why had no one looked closer at Garrido's backyard? The discovery forced agencies to admit hard truths. Systems designed to protect had failed at every level. Yet, in that moment, one fact overshadowed the failures. Jaycee was alive. Her daughters were safe, and a story that had once seemed destined to end in tragedy had instead become a rare tale of survival. The arrest of Philip and Nancy Garrido made headlines worldwide. Details of Jaycee's captivity horrified the public. But alongside outrage came questions. How had this gone undetected for so long? Investigations revealed disturbing failures. Garrido had been on parole since the 1970s with a history of kidnapping and sexual violence. He was visited by parole officers, sometimes standing just feet away from the backyard compound. Yet no one searched thoroughly enough to discover Jaycee. Neighbors, too, admitted they saw strange things: children's voices behind fences, unusual behavior from Garrido, but suspicions were brushed aside. It was a collective blind spot, a community conditioned to look away. In the courtroom, Garrido initially denied responsibility, but the evidence was overwhelming. Facing life in prison, he eventually pleaded guilty. In 2011, he was sentenced to 431 years to life. His wife Nancy received 36 years to life. Neither would walk free again. For Jaycee, the road ahead was complicated. Freedom was a shock to the system. She had to rebuild her identity, reconnect with her family, and adjust to a world filled with choices and noise after years of confinement. Her daughters, too, faced challenges. Learning that the only home they had ever known was built on a lie. But Jaycee demonstrated extraordinary resilience. She worked with therapists and support groups. She learned to drive, to manage finances, to live independently. And remarkably, she chose to speak publicly. In 2011, she published her memoir, A Stolen Life. Written in her own words, it was a raw, honest account of her ordeal and survival. The book became a bestseller, giving millions of readers a direct window into her experience. Later, she founded the Jaycee Foundation, dedicated to supporting families recovering from abduction and trauma. Her story reshaped public awareness. It became a case study in law enforcement training, parole monitoring, and community vigilance. Agencies reviewed how parolees with violent histories should be tracked. Schools and communities were reminded to take missing children cases seriously, no matter how much time had passed.
The larger lesson was sobering. Evil can hide in plain sight. Systems designed to protect can fail. And when suspicion is silenced, victims remain invisible. But Jaycee's survival also underscored human resilience, the ability to endure, adapt, and reclaim life after unimaginable hardship. Today, Jaycee Dugard lives quietly, focusing on her family and advocacy work. She does not allow her identity to be defined solely by her captivity. Instead, she insists on being known as a mother, an author, and a survivor. In the end, her story is both a tragedy and an inspiration. It reminds us of the dangers of complacency and the power of perseverance. Above all, it proves that even in the darkest circumstances, survival and hope remain possible.